Judge mocks Kanye West in court, only to be shocked by his genius legal skills. We dream of reaching 1,000 subscribers by the end of February. Subscribe to the channel and be part of this dream too. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the gavel struck 3 times against the judge's stand. The air was thick with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism, the kind that often surrounded high-profile figures like Kanye West. Dressed in an impeccably tailored black suit, he sat at the defendant's table, his expression calm, almost detached. Reporters lined the benches, their pens poised over notepads, waiting for their next viral headline. Across the room, Judge Albert Holloway adjusted his glasses, his demeanor reflecting a man who had already made up his mind. "Mr. West," he began, his voice laced with condescension, "I assume you understand the gravity of representing yourself in court?" A murmur rippled through the audience. How could a musician, a fashion mogul, possibly hold his own in a legal battle? The opposing attorney, a smugly confident man named Richard Lyman, smirked as he flipped through his case files. Kanye, however, remained unmoved, his fingers tapping lightly on the desk, as though he were composing a beat in his head. Judge Holloway leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "This court is not a stage, Mr. West. This is a place of law, where reason and precedent reign supreme." A low chuckle passed through the audience, and Kanye's lips twitched into a knowing smile. "With all due respect, Your Honor," he finally spoke, his voice smooth but firm. "If law is about precedent, then I'd like to remind the court that Abraham Lincoln himself had no formal legal education. Yet, he became one of the most revered lawyers in American history." The room fell silent. Even the court stenographer paused momentarily before continuing to type. The judge blinked, momentarily thrown off, but quickly recovered. "That may be, Mr. West, but you are no Abraham Lincoln," he shot back, his words sharp. Kanye simply shrugged, a glint of amusement in his eyes. "Neither was Harvard Law's first graduating class," he replied. The statement hung in the air, a calculated disruption to the judge's rhythm. The prosecution took over, eager to prove their point. Lyman rose, adjusting his tie with exaggerated confidence. "Let's not be distracted by theatrics. The facts remain. Mr. West is here today to answer to allegations of contract breach and financial misconduct." He turned to the jury, his voice dripping with manufactured sincerity. "This is a man who has built an empire, yes, but an empire on unpredictability and reckless decisions. We are talking about a businessman who has defied norms, sometimes to his detriment. He is here today not because of his brilliance, but because of his disregard for the fine print." Kanye listened, his expression unreadable. He let Lyman have his moment, let the judge nod along as if everything was proceeding as expected. Then, just as Lyman prepared to move forward with his next point, Kanye leaned into the microphone. "You ever heard of the case Lochner v. New York?" The question was unexpected. The courtroom stilled. Lyman hesitated, but the flicker of confusion in his eyes was enough. Kanye pressed on, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had done his homework. It was about a man's right to enter contracts freely. It set a precedent that changed the way business and labor laws were interpreted for decades. "You say I don't respect fine print? I say I respect it enough to know when it's written to keep power in the hands of a few." The judge shifted in his seat, his earlier amusement now replaced with intrigue. The audience leaned in, waiting. This was not the babbling of an arrogant celebrity trying to defend himself blindly. This was the calculated response of a man who had studied the very laws meant to entrap him. Kanye adjusted his cufflinks, his confidence unwavering. "Now, before we proceed," he said, locking eyes with Lyman, "tell me, do you want to keep playing the game where I'm the fool, or are we ready to have an actual legal discussion?" The courtroom, which had started as a stage for his humiliation, now felt more like a battleground of intellect. And for the first time that morning, Judge Holloway seemed to realize that Kanye West wasn't just here to play along. He was here to challenge the system on its own terms. Judge Holloway exhaled sharply, his fingers steepled in thought as he assessed the man before him. This was not the Kanye West he had expected, the flamboyant showman, the impulsive artist prone to grandiose statements. This was a man who had studied the intricacies of legal precedent, who had just delivered a compelling argument that even seasoned attorneys would hesitate to dismiss outright. Across the room, Richard Lyman's confidence wavered ever so slightly. He straightened his tie, masking his uncertainty with a smirk. "Mr. West," he said, feigning patience, "this is not a debate class at a university. This is a court of law, and while I appreciate your enthusiasm for legal history, we are here to discuss the specific breach of contract allegations levied against you." He turned to the jury, his voice sliding into well-practiced rhetoric. "Ladies and gentlemen, let's not be distracted. The evidence is clear. Mr. West willingly signed agreements, only to disregard them when they no longer serve his interests. That is not innovation. That is irresponsibility." Kanye leaned back in his chair, drumming his fingers against the table as though considering his next verse. Then, with a measured nod, he leaned into the microphone. "Interesting," he mused, "because what you just described sounds an awful lot like the legal doctrine of unconscionability." His voice was calm, deliberate. If a contract is so one-sided that it favors one party at the expense of another, the court has the right to deem it unenforceable. The idea isn't radical, it's precedent. He turned his gaze toward the jury, his expression unwavering. "See, the problem with contracts like the ones we're discussing today is that they're designed with the assumption that both parties enter with equal bargaining power. But that's a myth. Labels, corporations, institutions, they don't negotiate in good faith. They write contracts that stack the deck, and they count on the other side not knowing enough to fight back." His words carried weight, each syllable striking at the very foundation of Lyman's argument. The room felt charged, the initial amusement of the spectators giving way to intrigue. Even Judge Holloway, who had started the session convinced that Kanye's defense would be a circus act, found himself leaning in. "Mr. West," he said, his tone more measured now, "if you're suggesting that the contracts in question were unfairly structured, then you'll need to prove that they meet the criteria of procedural or substantive unconscionability. Do you have evidence to support such a claim?" The challenge was clear, but Kanye was unfazed. He reached into his neatly organized stack of documents and pulled out a highlighted section from one of the contracts. Holding it up for the courtroom to see, he read aloud, Clause 17.4. The signee waives the right to audit financial records related to royalty payments, and all disputes shall be resolved through binding arbitration chosen by the issuing party. He looked up, letting the words sink in. "In other words," he continued, "the people who control the money also get to decide if you can question them about it. No transparency, no accountability." He raised an eyebrow at Lyman. "Tell me, counselor, does that sound like an equal negotiation to you?" Lyman's smirk had vanished. He shifted in his seat, flipping through his notes, but no well-rehearsed argument could erase the fact that Kanye had just exposed a glaring imbalance in the contracts. The jury, once passive observers, now seemed fully engaged. Even members of the audience murmured in agreement. Judge Holloway studied the document Kanye had presented, his fingers tracing over the clause in question. "I will admit," he said slowly, "this raises valid concerns." He looked toward the prosecution. "Mr. Lyman, would you care to respond?" Lyman cleared his throat, scrambling to regain control of the narrative. "Your Honor, while the language may seem restrictive, this is standard industry practice." "Standard doesn't mean fair," Kanye interrupted smoothly. "Once upon a time, segregation was standard practice too. Didn't make it right." The courtroom fell into a hushed silence. The judge sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose as he considered the unexpected shift in momentum. What had started as an open and shut case was now unraveling into something far more complicated. Kanye had come prepared, not just with charisma, but with knowledge. And as he sat there, cool and composed, it was clear to everyone in the room that this was not a man who was going to be dismissed easily. He wasn't just defending himself. He was setting the stage for something bigger. And the court, whether they wanted to or not, was going to have to listen. The courtroom was no longer a place of easy predictions. What had begun as a trial designed to reprimand Kanye West for alleged contractual breaches was morphing into something far more compelling. A masterclass in legal strategy delivered by an artist who refused to play the role assigned to him. Judge Holloway sat straighter, His initial dismissiveness toward Kanye now replaced with begrudging interest. Across the room, Richard Lyman's carefully constructed confidence had begun to fracture, his once smug expression now tinged with irritation. He knew what was happening. Kanye was controlling the rhythm of the proceedings, turning what was supposed to be his downfall into a public revelation of the music industry's predatory legal practices. Lyman cleared his throat, forcing himself to regain composure. "Your Honor," he began, "this courtroom is not a platform for a social justice crusade. We are here to determine whether Mr. West willfully breached his contractual obligations, not to debate industry norms." He shot Kanye a sharp look, as if willing him to revert to the stereotype: impulsive, erratic, prone to outbursts. But Kanye remained impassive, merely tilting his head as though studying a lesser opponent. "Fair point," Kanye conceded, his voice even. "So let's talk about my obligations. According to the prosecution, I failed to deliver music under the terms of my contract, correct?" He turned to the jury, making sure he had their full attention. But what happens when a contract itself is built to be impossible to fulfill? What happens when you're given deadlines that are strategically unachievable, budgets that are manipulated in bad faith, and clauses that ensure the other side profits from your failure rather than your success? He placed his hands on the table, leaning forward slightly. "Let's talk about that," Lyman scoffed, sensing the danger of letting Kanye continue unchecked. "Objection, Your Honor. Mr. West is engaging in speculation and deflection. The terms of his contracts were agreed upon, not forced." Judge Holloway tapped his gavel once. "Sustained. Mr. West, if you have a claim of bad faith negotiation, I will need specific evidence." Kanye nodded, as though expecting the challenge. "Understood," he said, pulling out another document. "Your Honor, this is an internal email exchange between label executives discussing my contract." He handed a copy to the court clerk, who passed it to the judge and the prosecution. Lyman skimmed the document, and his face darkened. "This is irrelevant," he snapped. "It's nothing more than internal discussion." But the judge had already begun reading aloud. "Clause adjustments should ensure delays lead to higher penalties. If he misses the window, royalties shift in our favor. Ensure non-disclosure provisions remain ironclad." He looked up, his brows furrowed. "Mr. West, where did you obtain this?" Kanye's expression didn't change. "Discovery process," he replied. And a few well-placed questions to the right people. A slow ripple of reaction moved through the courtroom. The document was damning. It painted a picture of intentional manipulation, clauses designed not just for enforcement, but to trap him in an endless cycle of debt and control. The air in the courtroom shifted. This wasn't just a defense anymore. This was an exposure. The jury whispered among themselves, sensing the weight of what had just been revealed. Lyman, for the first time, looked genuinely unnerved. "Your Honor, I request a recess," he said hastily, his voice tight. But Kanye spoke before the judge could respond. "Why?" he asked, his tone deceptively casual. "So you can figure out how to spin this?" The question landed like a punch, and for the first time since the trial began, Lyman had no immediate retort. Judge Holloway exhaled, rubbing his temples. This was not the straightforward case he had envisioned. "We'll take a 20-minute recess," he announced, banging his gavel. The spectators murmured, excitement and disbelief intermingling as they rose from their seats. Kanye remained where he was, unmoving. He wasn't here to stall. He wasn't here to be humbled. He was here to win. As the courtroom emptied for recess, the atmosphere remained charged, thick with the realization that Kanye West had done more than just defend himself. He had turned the trial into an exposé of the legal traps designed to control artists. Reporters whispered hurriedly into their phones. Legal analysts frantically scribbled notes, and even the jury members exchanged uncertain glances. Judge Holloway retreated to his chambers, his mind racing. What had started as a simple case of contractual breach was now something far more dangerous, an indictment of an entire system. Meanwhile, in the hallway outside the courtroom, Richard Lyman paced, his jaw tight. He had underestimated Kanye. This wasn't the rambling, egotistical celebrity he had prepared to dismantle in front of an audience. This was a man who had done his homework, who understood not only the music industry, but the law that governed it. Lyman's assistant, a young legal aide, approached cautiously. "Sir," she said, voice low, "the press is already running with the story. If we don't pivot, this is going to turn into a public relations disaster." Lyman clenched his fists. He wasn't just fighting Kanye anymore. He was fighting the narrative Kanye was creating. And worse, he was losing. Back in the courtroom, Kanye sat alone at his table, flipping through his documents with quiet confidence. He knew what was happening behind closed doors. They were scrambling, trying to reframe the argument, trying to paint him as reckless, as uninformed, as anything but the intelligent, calculated man who had just dismantled their case piece by piece. He let out a slow breath. They were too late. He had already seized control. He glanced up as Judge Holloway re-entered, his face carefully neutral. The jury filed back in, their expressions unreadable, but Kanye could feel it. The shift, the doubt, the realization that maybe, just maybe, he was telling the truth. The judge cleared his throat. "We will resume proceedings," he announced, his tone firmer than before. "Mr. Lyman, do you have any rebuttal to Mr. West's claims?" Lyman stood, masking his unease with a tight-lipped smile. "Your Honor, while Mr. West has certainly presented an engaging argument, I would like to remind the court that legal contracts are binding documents. If Mr. West was dissatisfied with the terms, he had the opportunity to renegotiate." Kanye leaned into the microphone. "That's an interesting take," he said smoothly, "considering I have records showing that every attempt at renegotiation was met with increased restrictions, reduced creative control, and financial penalties." The courtroom stilled. Another document was handed to the clerk. More evidence. More proof. Lyman's confidence wavered, his arguments unraveling. Judge Holloway exhaled through his nose, tapping his gavel lightly. "Mr. West, while you have certainly raised substantial concerns, the question remains. What resolution are you seeking?" Kanye met the judge's gaze head-on. "I want more than my name cleared," he said, his voice steady. "I want a legal review of the contracts artists are forced to sign. I want transparency in royalty agreements. I want fair negotiation terms that don't rely on coercion." His words rang through the room, settling over the spectators like a weight. This was no longer just about Kanye West. This was about every artist who had ever been trapped, manipulated, and discarded by a system built to exploit them. Lyman's face turned pale. He could feel the case slipping from his grasp, turning into something far larger than he had ever anticipated. The judge sighed, rubbing his temples. He had expected a spectacle. Instead, he had been handed a revolution. "Very well," he said finally. "We will proceed." And just like that, the courtroom was no longer a place where Kanye West was on trial. It was a place where the industry itself was being questioned. The courtroom was no longer just a battleground for Kanye West's legal defense. It had become the epicenter of an industry-wide reckoning. The judge's reluctant agreement to proceed meant that this was no longer a simple contract dispute. This was something far more disruptive. As Kanye sat back in his chair, exuding the quiet confidence of a man who knew he had the upper hand, Richard Lyman clenched his jaw, flipping through his notes with visible frustration. He had prepared for arrogance, for outbursts, for unpredictable theatrics. But what he was facing was strategy, precision, and the terrifying realization that Kanye had come to win. Lyman forced himself to stand, inhaling deeply before addressing the judge. "Your Honor, while Mr. West is attempting to frame this as an attack on the industry as a whole, we cannot lose sight of the core issue. The fact remains that he signed legally binding agreements. Regardless of whether he found the terms unfair in hindsight, those agreements were upheld by law." He turned sharply toward Kanye. "Tell me, Mr. West, if these contracts were so egregious, why did you sign them?" The question hung in the air, baited with condescension. Lyman expected Kanye to stumble, to struggle to justify his own decisions. But Kanye only smiled, shaking his head slightly. "Because I had no choice," he said simply. The courtroom murmured, the tension thick. Kanye leaned forward, his hands clasped in front of him. "You're acting like signing a contract is the same as agreeing to fair terms," he said, his voice unwavering. "But let's talk about reality. When you're a young artist, stepping into a boardroom where executives throw million-dollar deals at you, they don't hand you a fair playing field. They hand you a take-it-or-leave-it contract, knowing full well that if you walk away, there's 100 other hungry artists ready to take your place. They exploit dreams. They use desperation as leverage. He glanced at the jury, his eyes sharp. So yeah, I signed, like every artist before me, like every artist after me, because that's how the game is rigged. Judge Holloway shifted in his seat, his initial skepticism now eroding under the weight of Kanye's argument. The industry was built on these contracts, carefully designed to give the illusion of opportunity while ensuring control remained with the powerful few. The realization was spreading through the room, and Kanye could feel it. He pressed forward. These contracts aren't partnerships. They're ownership papers disguised as deals, he continued. And I bet if we looked at the fine print of half the artists out there, we'd see the same thing. Clauses that lock them in, penalties that keep them bound, and loopholes that make it nearly impossible for them to break free. Lyman was losing his grip, and he knew it. This is all conjecture, he said quickly, his voice tight. Unless Mr. West has tangible evidence that this is a systemic issue and not just his personal grievance, then his claims hold no weight. Kanye didn't hesitate. He reached into his pile of documents and pulled out another file. Then let's talk about industry standards, he said, handing the paperwork to the clerk. These are contract comparisons from multiple artists under different labels, including major industry players. What you'll find is a pattern. Recurring clauses that strip artists of financial transparency, creative control, and future negotiation power. And it's not just my label. It's the entire system. The courtroom was silent. The press was scribbling furiously. The jury was leaning in. Even Judge Holloway was scanning the documents with an expression that bordered on concern. Lyman's face turned an unhealthy shade of red. He had walked right into a trap. By challenging Kanye to prove a pattern, he had unwittingly given him the perfect opening to introduce a broader indictment of the music industry itself. The judge exhaled, placing the documents aside. Mr. Lyman, he said, his voice measured, based on this new evidence, the court will require a further review of these contract patterns to determine if there is, in fact, an issue of systemic contractual imbalance. Lyman's mouth opened slightly before snapping shut. He had no counterargument, no quick pivot. Kanye had done the impossible. He had turned his personal defense into a class action level conversation. Kanye sat back, exuding the calm of a man who knew exactly what he had just done. He had come into this courtroom as the one on trial. But now, for the first time, the industry itself was the one being forced to answer. The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted. The weight of Kanye's evidence hung in the air like an unspoken truth that no one wanted to acknowledge, yet no one could ignore. Judge Holloway's face was unreadable, but there was no mistaking the slight furrow in his brow, the way his fingers tapped against his bench as he considered the implications. He had presided over countless contract disputes, had seen artists come and go, but never had he been forced to consider the possibility that the entire industry operated on a foundation of legal deception. The press in the back of the room whispered feverishly, their headlines already writing themselves. Kanye West turns courtroom into industry reckoning. Richard Lyman, now visibly unsettled, tried to regain control. He adjusted his tie and cleared his throat before turning back to the judge. Your Honor, with all due respect, this trial is not a referendum on the music industry. This is about whether Mr. West violated the terms of his contract, not about whether he likes those terms. He shot Kanye a sharp glance. He signed them. He benefited from them. And now, when it no longer suits him, he wants to rewrite history. His words were pointed, but there was something in his tone, an edge of desperation, an awareness that the courtroom was no longer on his side. Kanye folded his hands in front of him, his gaze unwavering. You keep saying that, he said evenly. That I signed, that I benefited. But tell me, Mr. Lyman, do you think every contract signed throughout history has been just? Do you think every deal ever made was fair simply because someone put their signature on it? He let the question hang, then continued. Slavery had contracts. Segregation had contracts. Sweatshops have contracts. That doesn't make them ethical. That doesn't make them right. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Even Judge Holloway sat up a little straighter, his fingers pausing mid-tap. Lyman scoffed, though the sound was more forced than genuine. "Are you seriously comparing your multimillion-dollar deals to slavery?" he asked, his voice laced with incredulity. But Kanye didn't flinch. "I'm comparing exploitation to exploitation," he said simply. "The scale changes, but the principle doesn't. When you trap people in unfair agreements, when you profit off their ignorance, when you structure deals to ensure one side always wins, that's not business. That's predation." His words cut through the courtroom, slicing away at the last remnants of skepticism in the jury's eyes. Judge Holloway let out a slow breath. "Mr. West," he said, his voice more careful now, "if you are making a claim of systemic exploitation, that is a matter beyond this courtroom's jurisdiction. However, if you can provide direct evidence that the contracts in question were signed under conditions of bad faith, coercion, or misrepresentation, then this case takes on a very different legal standing." Kanye nodded, already prepared. "Then let's talk about coercion," he said, pulling out another document. This is an affidavit from a former label executive. In it, he details how standard practice involves pressuring young artists into signing contracts within 24 hours, often without legal counsel, under the pretense that the deal will disappear if they hesitate. He slid the paper forward. "That's not a negotiation. That's a threat." Lyman stiffened. He could feel it slipping now, the entire case unraveling like a poorly tied knot. This is hearsay," he snapped. "One former executive's claims do not prove systemic wrongdoing." Kanye smiled, but it wasn't amusement. It was the look of a man who had just baited his opponent into a fatal move. "That's why I have 3 more," he said, handing over additional affidavits. "Different labels, different artists, same tactics." The courtroom was silent. Even the reporters, who had spent years covering high-profile cases, knew they were witnessing something unprecedented. Judge Holloway exhaled, rubbing his temples. "Given the weight of these allegations," he said slowly, "I will need to review all submitted evidence before proceeding." He turned to Lyman. "Mr. Lyman, unless you have an immediate rebuttal, this court is inclined to consider the possibility of a broader legal review." Lyman opened his mouth, then closed it. He had nothing. No counter. No spin. Nothing. Kanye had just changed the entire conversation. The judge tapped his gavel lightly. "Court is adjourned for the day. We will reconvene after I have reviewed the evidence." Kanye leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. But deep down he knew this wasn't just about his case anymore. This was about changing the game. The morning headlines hit like a tidal wave, each one more damning than the last. Kanye West's legal stunt, desperate attempt to save his career, unstable and unhinged. Is Kanye just playing the victim? Inside the courtroom meltdown, how West's conspiracy claims fall apart. The industry had struck back hard. Kanye sat in his hotel room, watching the news cycle unfold exactly as he had predicted. Every major outlet was running with the same narrative. He was erratic, desperate, trying to manipulate the system instead of taking responsibility for his own decisions. Old video clips resurfaced, moments of past controversies edited together to make him look irrational. Paid analysts debated his mental stability rather than the legal issues at hand. His attorney paced the room, frustration evident in her expression. "They're not even arguing the case," she muttered. "They're making this about you instead of the contracts." Kanye nodded, unmoved. "That's their only play," he said, leaning back in his chair. "They can't fight the facts, so they're going to try to make me the villain. They want the world to believe that I'm the problem, not the system." He exhaled slowly, fingers tapping against the armrest. But they made a mistake. His attorney raised an eyebrow. "And what's that?" Kanye turned to her, a slow smile forming. "They underestimated how many artists feel the same way I do." The first ripple came from an unexpected source, an up-and-coming artist, barely 22, who had just signed his first major contract. He took to social media, posting a screenshot of his contract with the caption, "They told me this was standard, so why does it look exactly like the ones Kanye exposed?" Then a second artist, and a third. Within hours, the conversation had shifted. Big-name producers and independent musicians started speaking up, sharing their own experiences with predatory contracts. The industry had hoped to make Kanye look isolated. Instead, he had become the rallying point for a much larger movement. Meanwhile, Richard Lyman sat in his office, his grip tightening around his coffee cup as he watched the narrative slip out of his control. The executives in the room were no longer just concerned. They were furious. This was supposed to kill the story, not spread it. One of them barked. Why the hell are artists siding with him? Lyman pinched the bridge of his nose. Because we pushed too hard, he admitted. We made it obvious. He looked up at the group. We need a new angle. And fast. An older executive, silent until now, finally spoke. We need to settle. Quietly. Before this gets bigger. Silence fell over the room. The very idea of offering Kanye a settlement, of admitting, even slightly, that he had a point, was unthinkable. But so was the alternative. If this spiraled any further, it wouldn't just be Kanye's contracts under scrutiny. It would be the entire music industry. Kanye's phone rang. He glanced at the screen, recognizing the number immediately. He answered, putting the call on speaker for his attorney to hear. Lyman's voice was calm, professional, but there was an edge of unease. Mr. West, he said, I think we've all had enough theatrics. Let's be pragmatic. The industry isn't perfect, but a prolonged legal battle won't help anyone. Kanye smirked. That's an interesting way to say we're losing. Lyman ignored the jab. We're prepared to offer you a substantial settlement. We'll renegotiate your existing contracts, grant you full ownership of your masters, and Kanye cut him off. And Lyman hesitated. And in exchange, you drop this case. You stop pushing this systemic corruption narrative. You make a statement clarifying that your situation was unique and doesn't reflect the industry as a whole. Kanye let the offer hang in the air for a moment. It was tempting. Getting full control of his masters was something he had fought for his entire career. The money, the new contracts, it was everything he had wanted. But then he thought about the young artist who had posted his contract that morning. About the countless others who wouldn't get this offer. About the system that would continue, untouched if he took the deal and walked away. His fingers tightened around the phone. Let me get this straight, he said. You're offering to free me. As long as I keep my mouth shut about everyone else? Lyman hesitated. Mr. West, this is the best deal you're going to get. Kanye's jaw clenched. Then, slowly he grinned. See you in court. Lyman exhaled slowly. I'll make the call. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Richard Lyman had expected hesitation, negotiation, anything but outright refusal. Kanye West had just turned down an offer that most artists would have killed for. Ownership of his masters. A clean slate. Financial freedom. Yet, here he was rejecting it without a second thought. Lyman exhaled sharply, his voice tightening. Mr. West, I strongly advise you to reconsider. Kanye chuckled, his tone dripping with confidence. Nah. See, the problem is you still think I'm playing for a paycheck. But I ain't here for a payout. I'm here to change the rules of the game. Lyman knew the conversation was over. He muttered a curse under his breath before hanging up. Across the room, Kanye's attorney stared at him, her expression unreadable. You just walked away from millions, she said, her voice quiet but firm. Kanye leaned back, hands behind his head. I walked away from hush money, he corrected. If I take that deal, the story ends. The industry wins. They get to keep doing this to every artist that comes after me. But if I fight, he turned to face her fully, his eyes burning with determination. If I fight and win, they'll never be able to pull this again. His attorney sighed, running a hand through her hair. You realize they're going to double down, right? The settlement was their way of cutting their losses. Now, they'll come after you with everything they've got. It didn't take long for the gloves to come off. Within 24 hours of Kanye rejecting the settlement, the attacks escalated. The headlines became nastier, the accusations more vicious. Kanye West is destroying his own career, again. West's courtroom delusions. When ego overrides logic. Music executives speak out. West's claims are ludicrous and baseless. Major record labels release statements, carefully crafted to sound neutral, but designed to discredit him. While we respect Mr. West's artistic contributions, His recent claims misrepresent standard industry practices and create unnecessary confusion. They never denied the allegations outright. They just cast enough doubt to make people question him. At the same time, Kanye's financial records mysteriously started leaking. Reports circulated about his spending habits, his past legal battles, anything to frame him as reckless and irresponsible. Late-night talk show hosts mocked him. Social media exploded with debates, some calling him a revolutionary, others labeling him unhinged. But the one thing that became clear? The industry was scared. Kanye nodded. Then let him come. Despite the media onslaught, something unexpected happened. The more the industry tried to silence Kanye, the more people started listening. Other artists, some massive, some unknown, began speaking out. A Grammy-winning singer tweeted, "Been silent for too long. Kanye's telling the truth." A veteran producer posted a thread breaking down predatory contract clauses, detailing how labels manipulated artists into impossible deals. Even retired legends, musicians who had long been out of the industry's grip, started sharing their experiences. And then came the bombshell. A former executive, one of the top power players in the music business, came forward anonymously. In an exclusive interview, his voice disguised, he confirmed everything Kanye had said. "We design contracts to keep artists in perpetual debt. We front the millions, but we control their revenue streams. They don't own their masters. They don't own their publishing. And when they try to renegotiate, we bury them." The interview went viral. The conversation shifted. No longer was this just about Kanye West. This was about every artist who had ever been trapped in a system that wasn't built for them. Inside his hotel room, Kanye scrolled through the flood of messages pouring in. Some from fans, some from artists he had never met, thanking him for fighting a battle they never had the power to fight themselves. His attorney walked in, dropping a thick stack of legal documents onto the table. "The judge has approved a full contract review," she said. "Not just yours, the industry's. They opened Pandora's box trying to shut you up, and now the court wants to see everything." Kanye smirked. "That means we've got him." She exhaled. "It also means they're going to do everything in their power to stop us." Kanye stood, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt, his expression unreadable. "Then we better make sure they don't." The court date was set. The industry was ready to crush him. But Kanye West? He was ready to change history. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation. This was no longer just a contract dispute. This was a war. Kanye West against an industry that had operated in the shadows for decades. Reporters lined the aisles, cameras flashing as the world waited to see whether one man could truly take on an empire. Judge Holloway sat at his bench, his expression unreadable. He knew the weight of this case, the precedent it could set. This was no longer about just Kanye. This was about every artist, every contract, every exploitation buried beneath legal jargon. He tapped his gavel once, commanding silence. "We will now hear the arguments regarding systemic industry practices and their potential impact on contractual fairness." Richard Lyman stood first, his suit pristine, his confidence carefully reconstructed despite the damage Kanye had inflicted on his case. "Your Honor," he began, "this trial has spiraled far beyond its original scope. Mr. West has turned a simple contract dispute into a conspiracy theory against the entire music industry." He gestured toward Kanye, feigning amusement. "While he may be a talented entertainer, this court deals in facts, not spectacle." Kanye didn't flinch. Instead, he calmly rose, adjusting his jacket. "Spectacle," he repeated, his voice smooth. "You mean like record labels owning the rights to music they didn't write, didn't perform, didn't produce forever?" He turned to the jury. "You mean like contracts that force artists to pay back their own advances with interest so high they never see a dime of their royalties?" His eyes swept the courtroom. "You mean like the fact that every major artist you've ever loved has had to fight tooth and nail just to own their own work?" The tension in the room was palpable. Judge Holloway tapped his pen against his desk. "Mr. West, if you wish to challenge industry standards, you need concrete evidence." Kanye nodded. "Let's talk evidence, then." He pulled out another stack of documents, setting them on the table. "These," he said, "are contracts from artists across multiple labels, spanning the last 30 years. He gestured to his attorney, who handed copies to the judge, the jury, and the opposing counsel. What you'll find, Kanye continued, is the same exploitative language, over and over. Ownership clauses disguised as standard practice. Royalty calculations so convoluted that even accountants struggle to explain them. Arbitration clauses designed to make sure artists never see justice in a real courtroom. Lyman's face darkened. He flipped through the pages, his confidence wavering as the undeniable pattern became clear. Kanye leaned in, his voice steady. So tell me, Mr. Lyman, is it still just my problem? The industry scrambles. Across the city, inside the headquarters of a major record label, a group of executives huddled around a TV, watching the trial unfold live. The CEO, a man who had spent his career controlling narratives, clenched his jaw. "This is worse than we thought," he muttered. "He's not just exposing his case. He's exposing everyone's." A junior executive swallowed hard. Do we pull the plug?" The CEO's glare was ice cold. "You think we can afford to let this go to a verdict?" He turned to his legal advisor. "Find a way to shut this down. Fast." Lyman straightened his tie, trying to regain control. "Your Honor," he said, voice tight, "while Mr. West has certainly brought forth extensive documentation, the reality is simple. No one forced him to sign these contracts. No one forces any artist to accept a deal." Kanye let out a quiet laugh. "That's cute," he said. "You ever seen a young artist with no legal team, no financial background, sitting in a boardroom, surrounded by millionaires telling him, 'Sign now, or the opportunity disappears'? You ever seen a kid who just wants to make music being told he's lucky to even have a contract?" His voice grew stronger. "That's not negotiation. That's coercion." With a smile, the jury's expressions shifted. They understood now. Judge Holloway exhaled, looking at the piles of evidence before him. He was running out of reasons to dismiss Kanye's claims, and the industry knew it. Then, something unexpected happened. The courtroom doors opened. A man walked in. Not just any man. A legendary artist. Someone who had spent decades in the industry. Someone whose voice had shaped entire generations of music. Gasps filled the room. Kanye smiled. "Glad you could make it." The legend took a seat next to Kanye's legal team and placed a folder on the table. "Your Honor," he said, his voice calm but commanding, "I have something to add to this case." Lyman paled. He knew what was happening. The industry's worst nightmare was unfolding in real time. This wasn't just Kanye West fighting alone anymore. This was the beginning of a revolution. The courtroom fell into a stunned silence as Quincy Reynolds, a legendary artist with decades in the industry, took his seat beside Kanye. The weight of his presence was undeniable. This was a man who had seen it all, who had built an empire within the system, now standing against it. Judge Holloway studied him carefully. "Mr. Reynolds, you understand that your testimony must be relevant to the case at hand?" Quincy nodded. "Your Honor, I'm here because I've seen firsthand how this industry traps artists." Kanye isn't exaggerating. He's exposing the truth. He placed a thick folder on the table. Inside this file are contracts from artists across multiple decades, all with the same exploitative clauses. Lyman stiffened. "Your Honor, this is irrelevant. These are not Mr. West contracts." Judge Holloway flipped through the pages, his expression shifting as he read. "Mr. Lyman, these documents suggest a pattern of predatory business practices." He looked up. "Would you care to explain why so many artists across different labels and generations have nearly identical clauses designed to restrict their ownership and earnings?" Lyman opened his mouth, but no words came. Kanye seized the moment. "This ain't just about me. This is about every artist who's ever signed away their future, thinking they had no other choice." Judge Holloway exhaled. "Given the severity of these claims, I am ordering a full review of the presented evidence before issuing my final ruling." He banged the gavel. "Court is adjourned." As the crowd erupted in whispers, Kanye turned to Quincy and grinned. "Now they know we're serious." The courtroom was silent as everyone waited for Judge Holloway to return. The recess had lasted longer than expected, fueling speculation that something was happening behind closed doors. The industry was making its last desperate moves, trying to bury the case before it could set a precedent. Kanye sat still, his fingers interlocked, his expression unreadable. His attorney leaned in. They're throwing everything at this judge. Pressure, threats, lobbying. If they can't win, they'll try to stall this until you break. Kanye exhaled slowly. Then we don't break. The doors swung open, and Judge Holloway took his seat. The murmurs died instantly. He cleared his throat, looking at the evidence stacked before him. This case has revealed concerning and widespread contractual practices within the music industry, he said. After reviewing the evidence, I find that Mr. West has sufficiently demonstrated a pattern of coercive and unfair agreements that extend beyond his personal case. The air thickened. This court rules in favor of Mr. West, the judge continued. His contracts are hereby voided, and he is granted full ownership of his masters and intellectual property. Furthermore, I am recommending a formal investigation into the broader contractual practices within the industry. The courtroom erupted. Kanye closed his eyes for a moment, letting the victory settle in. Lyman sat frozen, his mouth slightly open, his entire strategy crumbling before him. Outside, the media went wild. Kanye West wins landmark case. Trended worldwide. Artists everywhere began demanding contract transparency. Record labels scrambled, terrified of what would come next. A week later, in his first public interview, Kanye was asked, "What's next?" He leaned forward, a smirk forming. Now we build something better. If you made it this far, comment where you're watching from and let us know if the story of justice moved you.